They told you to be patient. They told you to communicate better, to set boundaries with love, to explain your feelings calmly, to try harder. You followed every piece of advice. You read the books. You had the conversations. You gave them more chances than you can count. And what did you get in return? The same cold stare, the same dismissal, the same invisible wall that no amount of effort, kindness, or understanding could ever break through. Here is what no one is willing to say out loud. Everything you were told to do was wrong, not because you did it badly, but because it was never going to work. Not with them. Not with them. Not with this kind of person. Because the narcissist does not operate on the same psychological rules as the rest of us. And until you understand exactly how their mind works, not on the surface, not the version they perform for the world, but the raw, hidden machinery underneath, you will keep trying strategies designed for a person who does not exist. This is not a video about how to fix them. It is not a video about how to love them better. It is about one thing only. The single shift, the only shift, that will ever make a narcissist respect you. And by the time we are finished, you are going to understand not just what that shift is, but why it is the only thing that has ever had a chance of working. But to get there, we have to start at the beginning. We have to go back to the moment before you knew what you were dealing with. Back to when it all felt like the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to you. When they first entered your life, it did not feel dangerous. It felt like relief. Like finally, like someone had arrived who truly saw you, all of you, and chose you anyway. They moved fast. They were intense. They said things people do not usually say, till months or years into knowing someone. They made you feel extraordinary, chosen, like you had been discovered by someone rare enough to recognize your value. You were not falling in love so much as you were being pulled into a gravitational field, so powerful you did not even notice the ground disappearing beneath your feet. And here is what made it so convincing. They seemed to respect you. More than anyone ever had, they listened. They mirrored your values back to you like a perfect reflection. They prioritized you. They showed up. If respect is the feeling of being truly seen and genuinely valued, then what they gave you in those early days felt like the deepest respect you had ever known. Except it was not respect. It was reconnaissance. When a narcissist enters your life, they are not falling in love. They are conducting an assessment. They are learning the specific frequencies of your deepest needs. What makes you feel safe? What makes you feel chosen? What wounds you carry that have not yet healed? And they are building a custom signal designed to speak directly to every single one of them. The warmth you felt was not genuine warmth. It was your own warmth, reflected back at you with surgical precision. Think about what real respect actually requires. Real respect is slow. It takes time to understand another person well enough to honor their complexity. It takes patience to hold space for someone else's contradictions, their difficult days, their imperfections. Real respect is the recognition that another person exists as a complete, independent universe with rights and needs and inner life that have nothing to do with you. It is the choice to honor that universe, even when doing so is inconvenient. The narcissists did none of that. What they did was faster and colder than that. They saw what you offered, your warmth, your empathy, your loyalty, your status, your beauty, your resources, and they attached themselves to those qualities the way a parasite attaches to a host. They were not seeing you, they were seeing what you could do for them. And the performance of adoration they put on in those early days was not love, it was acquisition. This is the first truth you have to absorb before anything else can make sense. You were never disrespected because you did something wrong. You were never disrespected because you were not enough. You were set up from the very first moment by someone who was never capable of offering you the thing they so brilliantly convinced you they were offering. The respect was always a mask, and masks, no matter how beautiful, always slip. Because here is what nobody tells you about the beginning. That golden, intoxicating beginning that you have probably spent years trying to get back to. It was not a preview of what the relationship could be, it was bait. It was designed to be irresistible so that when it disappeared, you would spend everything you had trying to get it back. Your confusion, your grief, your endless attempts to fix things. All of that was built into the structure of what they created at the start. The trap was set before you ever walked into the room. So when the warmth disappeared, when the admiration curdled into criticism, when the attention became withdrawal, when the person who made you feel like the center of the universe began treating you like an inconvenience, your instinct was to look at yourself. What did I do wrong? How can I fix this? How do I get back to how things were? And that instinct, that desperate inward search for the fault, was exactly what they needed from you. Because as long as you were focused on fixing yourself, you were not looking at them. And as long as you were not looking at them clearly, they remain in control, but you are looking at them now. And that changes everything. The first thing you need to undo. Stand about a narcissist practice that it is not the same thing as the respect you are trying to earn. When you imagine respect, you picture something warm, acknowledgement, consideration, being genuinely heard. When a narcissist respects someone, it has nothing to do with warmth. It is closer to caution. It is what happens when they encounter a force they cannot override. It is the involuntary response of a predator that has just discovered its prey has teeth. You cannot earn that response through kindness. You cannot earn it through understanding. You cannot earn it by becoming easier to be with or harder to upset. Those strategies do not register in their world because those strategies belong to a different kind of relationship entirely. The kind built on mutual humanity, on reciprocity, on the assumption that both people involved actually want to understand each other. That is not the relationship you are in. And the sooner you stop trying to win a game designed for a different board, the sooner you can understand the only move that actually matters. In the next part, we go inside their psychology, not to excuse it, but to understand it with the kind of clarity that finally sets you free. Because you cannot outmaneuver something you do not understand, and what is living inside the narcissist's mind is not what you think it is. The narcissist you know, the one who dominates every room, who speaks with absolute certainty, who cannot tolerate being contradicted, who acts as though the world owes them a permanent debt. That person looks powerful from the outside. They are supposed to look powerful. That is the entire point. But if you could step behind the performance, behind the armor of arrogance and entitlement, behind every grandiose gesture and cutting remark, you would not find strength. You would find something that looks a great deal more like terror. Here is the psychological reality that changes everything. The narcissist's ego is not large. It is catastrophically fragile. It is a structure built not on genuine self-worth, but on an endless, exhausting performance of self-worth. And like any performance, it requires a constant audience, constant validation, and the complete absence of anything that might expose it as theater. Their grandiosity is not confidence. It is compensation. It is what a person builds when the authentic self underneath is so buried in shame and self-contempt that they cannot afford to let anyone, including themselves, catch even a glimpse of it. This is the contradiction at the heart of every narcissist you have ever met. They behave as though they are superior to everyone around them, while secretly being convinced they are less than everyone around them. And because they cannot live with that conviction, they have constructed an elaborate psychological fortress designed to keep that truth locked away. You are not just a partner to them. You are part of that fortress. Your admiration was a wall. Your love was a foundation. Your compliance was structural. Without it, the whole thing threatens to collapse. Now think about what happened every time you stood your ground, every time you contradicted them, every time you expressed a need they did not want to meet, or held a boundary they did not want to respect, or simply had a bad day and needed something from them instead of giving something to them. Think about how disproportionate their reaction always was. The fury over something small, the punishment that lasted for days over a single moment of perceived defiance. The way they could turn an ordinary conversation into a courtroom where you were always, somehow, the one on trial. That reaction was never actually about you. It was about the fortress. Your disagreement was not a different Eve opinion to them. It was a structural threat. Every moment you behaved like a separate, autonomous human being with your own valid perspective. You were, in their unconscious experience, pulling a brick out of the wall, and a person whose entire psychological survival depends on that wall will respond to that threat with everything they have, not because you were wrong, but because you were dangerous. This is why logic never worked. This is why evidence never worked. This is why your most careful, compassionate attempts to have a reasonable conversation always ended the same way, with them deflecting, attacking, rewriting history, turning it back on you. You were not dealing with someone who was listening to your argument and finding it unconvincing. You were dealing with someone whose psychological immune system had identified your calm, rational truth-telling as a threat to its survival and responded accordingly. You were not in a conversation, you were in a defense mechanism. And here's the part that is painful, but essential. The more you tried to reason with them, the more you inadvertently confirmed something they desperately needed to believe about you. Because in the narcissist binary world, a world with no middle ground, no gray, no nuance, there are only two positions available, dominant or submissive, superior or inferior, predator or prey. Every time you softened your approach, every time you apologized for something you did not do, every time you swallowed your truth to keep the peace, you are not being kind. You are, in their internal logic, confessing to inferiority. You were placing yourself below them. And the moment you did that, the moment you entered their world on their terms, you handed them something they should never have been given, the authority to define your value. This is the trap that so many people in these relationships started early, all into, and cannot find their way out of, because it feels like the right thing to do. Empathy feels like a virtue. Patience feels like strength. Accommodation feels like love. And with a healthy person, it is all of those things. But with a narcissist, those same qualities become the mechanism of your own diminishment. Your empathy becomes their excuse. Your patience becomes their permission. Your accommodation becomes the evidence they use to justify treating you as less than human. You are not weak for falling into this. You are operating from a framework built for connection, and you were applying it to someone who was operating from a framework built for control. You brought a paintbrush to a chess match. The rules were never the same on both sides of the table. So what does this mean for respect? What does it mean that their ego is this fragile, that their inner world operates this way, that the very things you offered in love were the things that cost you their regard? It means that respect for a narcissist is not something that can be given. It is something that has to be encountered. It is what happens when they come up against something they cannot flatten, cannot manipulate, cannot move. It is not an emotion they choose to feel toward you. It is a response they cannot help but have when they discover that you are immovable. You cannot perform immovability. You cannot negotiate your way to it. You cannot negotiate your way to it. You cannot be strategic enough or careful enough or articulate enough to manufacture it. It is not a tactic. It is a state of being, and it begins not with anything you do to them, but with something you do for yourself. Something that for a long time felt impossible because they had worked so hard to convince you it was. It begins with the moment you stop needing them to agree with your reality in order to trust it. That sentence is worth sitting with, because if you have spent time in a relationship with a narcissist, you know exactly how thoroughly they can undermine your grip on your own experience. You remember something clearly, and they tell you it did not happen. You feel hurt, and they tell you you are too sensitive. You express a need, and they tell you it is unreasonable. And after enough repetitions of that cycle, something starts to shift inside you. You stop trusting your own perceptions. You start running every internal experience through their filter before you allow yourself to believe it. You outsource the authority over your own inner life to the one person who has the most to gain from keeping you confused. That is where the real damage lives, not in the cruelty, as devastating as that is, in the erosion of your certainty about your own reality. And that is exactly where the rebuilding has to begin. In the next part, we get to the shift itself, the concrete internal transformation that changes everything. Not a technique, not a script, something deeper and more permanent than either of those things. There is a moment that survivors of narcissistic relationships describe in almost identical terms, regardless of where they are from, regardless of how long the relationship lasted, regardless of the specific details of what they endured. It is not a dramatic moment. It does not look like strength from the outside. It often happens alone in an ordinary place, sitting on the edge of a bed, standing in a kitchen, staring out a window. And it arrives not with a burst of anger or a sudden revelation, but with something quieter and more final than either of those things. It arrives with exhaustion so complete that the performance simply stops, the explaining stops, the justifying stops, the endless internal negotiation between what you know and what they insist stops. And in that silence, something that has been buried for a very long time finally surfaces. A voice, your voice, saying one thing with absolute clarity. Enough. That moment is not the end. It is the beginning of the only thing that has ever worked. What happens in that moment is not a decision so much as a return to yourself, to the part of you that existed before they arrived and began the slow work of convincing you that your perceptions were unreliable, your needs were excessive, your worth was conditional, and your reality required their approval to be valid. The part of you they needed to dismantle in order to maintain control. That part did not disappear. It went quiet. It learned to wait. It learned to wait. And it has been waiting through every argument and every silent treatment and every silent treatment and every cycle of cruelty, followed by just enough warmth to keep you in place for exactly this moment. Psychologists call what you rebuild in this moment self-concept clarity, the degree to which you have a stable, consistent, clearly defined sense of who you are. Research shows consistently that people with high self-concept clarity are dramatically less susceptible to manipulation, less destabilized by external criticism, and far more capable of making decisions that align with their actual values rather than their fear. It is not arrogance. It is not arrogantity. It is simply knowing yourself well enough that another person's version of you cannot overwrite your own. The narcissist spent the entire relationship attacking your self-concept clarity. Every time they rewrote history, they were blurring your sense of what was real. Every time they responded to your emotions with contempt, they were teaching you that your inner experience was not trustworthy. Every time they shifted the meaning of their own behavior. This is love. This is normal. You are the problem. They were inserting themselves as the authority between you and your own mind. The erosion was gradual enough that you may not have noticed it happening, but you felt the result, that creeping uncertainty, that constant second-guessing, that exhausting habit of checking your own perceptions against their reaction before deciding whether to trust them. Rebuilding self-concept clarity is not about positive thinking. It is not about convincing yourself you are worthy through repetition. It is about something more practical and more demanding than that. It is about the daily, sometimes hourly, practice of noticing when you are running your experience through their filter and choosing not to. It is the practice of saying, I feel what I feel, and I do not require their agreement to feel it. I know what happened, and I do not require their confirmation to know it. I am who I am, and I do not require their approval to be it. This sounds simple. It is not simple, because they have installed that filter so deeply and reinforced it so consistently that it has started to feel like your own thinking. When you catch yourself minimizing your pain, well, maybe I was overreacting, that is their voice, not yours. When you second guess a memory, maybe it did not happen the way I remember, that is their voice. When you feel guilty for having a need, ashamed of your emotions, afraid of your own anger, that is their voice. Reclaiming your self-concept means learning to hear the difference between your voice and theirs. And every time you choose yours, you take back a piece of ground they had occupied inside you. Here is where this connects directly to respect. When you begin to operate from genuine self-concept clarity, when you stop needing their validation to feel stable, when your sense of reality stops depending on their agreement, something in your behavior shifts that you do not have to consciously perform. You stop explaining yourself compulsively because you are no longer trying to convince them of something you already know. You stop arguing in circles because you no longer need them to admit they were wrong in order to know that you were right. You stop absorbing their projections, not because you are defending against them, but because there is no longer a gap in your self-perception for those projections to fill. And the narcissist feels this. This is crucial to understand. They are extraordinarily attuned to power dynamics, hyper-vigilant observers of who has psychological leverage and who does not, and they will feel the shift in you before you can articulate it. Not because you have become colder or more aggressive or more strategic, but because you have become solid. And solid things cannot be manipulated the way fluid things can. You cannot gaslight someone who trusts their own mind. You cannot destabilize someone who does not need your stability. You cannot control someone whose sense of self does not depend on your approval. This is when something unexpected begins to happen in the dynamic. The tactics that once worked so reliably start to misfire. They make a cutting remark, and you do not crumble. You look at them with a steadiness that makes them feel, for a moment profoundly, unseen. They rewrite history, and you do not argue. You simply hold your own version with a quiet certainty that refuses to negotiate. They withdraw their warmth, expecting panic, and you give them something they have never received from you before, something that disturbs them far more than any argument could. Indifference, not performed indifference. Real indifference, the indifference that comes not from not caring about yourself, but from no longer needing them to care about you in order to be okay. That is the shift. That is the thing they cannot manufacture a response to, because every tool they have, is built to exploit your need for their approval. The moment that need is genuinely gone, not suppressed, not hidden, but dissolved at the root, their entire toolkit becomes obsolete. This is what forces the first involuntary flicker of something that functions like respect in the narcissist's psychology. Not admiration, not warmth, something colder and more instinctive than that. The recognition that they are no longer dealing with someone they can override. That recognition does not come from anything you say to them. It comes from what they can no longer do to you. It comes from the discovery that the buttons they installed no longer produce the reactions they were designed to produce. It comes from the moment they realize, at some level beneath conscious thought, that the person standing in front of them is no longer the person they built their control around. You did not become someone new. You became someone again, someone they never actually knew, because the version of you they knew was a version shaped by their pressure and maintained by your fear of their disapproval. The real you, the one with clarity and ground, and a self that does not require their endorsement, that person was always going to be impossible for them to fully control. They sensed it in the beginning, which is part of why they worked so hard to bury it. Now it is back, and in the final part we look at what you do with it. You have done the internal work. You have found your way back to yourself. You have rebuilt the ground beneath your feet, and you have felt the shift, that quiet, unshakable steadiness that no longer trembles when they raise their voice or withdraws when they turn cold. You know what is real. You trust what you feel. You no longer need their agreement to stand in your own truth. And now you are facing the question that every person at this stage eventually has to answer. What do you actually do with this? Because inner transformation, as profound and necessary as it is, still has to meet the external world. It still has to walk into the room where they standing and decide how to move. The answer begins with the most misunderstood concept in every conversation about narcissistic relationships: boundaries. The word has become so overused that it has almost lost its meaning, reduced to something people set and announce and then brace themselves to defend. But a real boundary, the kind that actually changes a dynamic, the kind that a narcissist cannot simply wait out or argue away, is nothing like that. A real boundary is not a wall you build between yourself and another person. It is a line you draw around yourself. It is the physical and behavioral expression of everything you rebuilt internally. It is self-concept clarity made visible in the world. And the critical difference between a boundary that works and a boundary that collapses is simple. A real boundary is not a message to them. It is a decision for you. When most people set a boundary with a narcissist, they are still, at some level, hoping for a response. They want the narcissist to hear the boundary and understand it and choose to respect it. They are still, in other words, outsourcing the authority to the narcissist, still waiting for their acknowledgement to make the boundary feel real. And the narcissist knows this. They can feel the plea inside the declaration, and they respond to it with exactly the contempt they reserve for anything that asks them for something. The boundary set from genuine self-concept clarity sounds completely different, because it is not asking for anything. It is simply describing reality. It is the difference between saying, I need you to stop speaking to me that way, and saying, I will not be part of a conversation that sounds like this, and then leaving the room. The first is a request that requires their compliance to mean anything. The second is an action that is entirely within your own power, regardless of what they do or say or feel. One hands them control, the other removes them from the equation entirely. This is the behavioral expression of the internal shift. And when it is real, when it comes from a place of genuine self-possession rather than performance, it produces something in the narcissist that very few things ever produce: uncertainty, because they have no script for this. Every manipulation they have ever used depends on you staying in the interaction, on you continuing to want something from them. On the conversation continuing long enough for them to redirect it, reframe it, flip it, and ultimately land in the position of power they always need to occupy. The moment you simply stop, not in anger, not in dramatic exit, but in the quiet, matter-of-fact way of someone who has better things to do, you remove the stage from underneath their performance. And a performer without a stage is just a person standing in an empty room, alone with themselves. For a narcissist, that is the most intolerable place in the world to be. You will see their tactics change as this becomes your consistent pattern. When the contempt stops producing your distress, they will try a different frequency. They may become suddenly reasonable, calm, even generous, briefly and disarmingly like the person from the beginning. This is not growth, this is recalibration. They are searching for the new entry point, the angle that still works, the frequency your defenses have not yet covered. They will cycle through guilt. I thought you loved me. They will cycle through pity. You have no idea what I am going through. They will cycle through nostalgia. Remember when things were good between us. Each of these is a test, not a conscious, deliberate test, but a behavioral probe. The way water finds every possible crack in a structure before it accepts that the structure is sealed. Your response to each of these does not need to be aggressive or cold or even particularly firm in its tone. It simply needs to be consistent. Calm and consistent is far more powerful than dramatic and unpredictable, because dramatic reactions, even angry ones, even ones entirely justified by what they have done, still tell them something useful, that they can affect you, that there is still enough emotional charge between you and them that the right trigger can produce a visible reaction. Calm consistency tells them something far more unsettling, that the charge is gone, that whatever it was they had over you has been quietly, completely, and permanently disconnected. This is the point at which something that looks from the outside like respect begins to appear in their behavior. It is not the respect of love or admiration. Do not make the mistake of interpreting it that way. It is closer to the respect the force of nature commands. They do not want to respect you. There is no warmth in it for them. But they cannot help adjusting their behavior in response to someone who has made it consistently clear that the old tools no longer function. They begin to edit themselves around you in small but unmistakable ways. The cutting remarks become less frequent, not because they have developed compassion, but because cutting remarks that land in silence, rather than producing visible pain, are not satisfying to them. The mind games become less elaborate, not because they have stopped wanting to play, but because a game that produces no reaction is not a game. It is just effort with no reward. You will also face the hardest moment in this entire process. The moment when everything you have built, your clarity, and your steadiness, your beautifully reclaimed self, comes up against the oldest and most powerful thing they have ever used against you, the memory of how it felt in the beginning. There will be a moment, perhaps many moments, when they manage to briefly resurrect something of that original frequency, when they look at you in a way that reminds you of before, when they say something that sounds for just a second like the person you fell for, and every part of you that still grieves what you thought this was going to be will want to respond, will want to believe, will want the story to have a different ending than the one you now know it has. This is the moment that determines everything. Not because giving in makes you weak. You have survived enough to know you are not weak, but because this is where the deepest self-knowledge is required. The knowledge that what they are offering in that moment is not a return to something real. It is the most sophisticated manipulation they possess, the one that uses your own love, your own hope, your own profound human need for the story to make sense against you. Seeing it clearly does not mean becoming hard. It means becoming wise. It means honoring your grief without letting it make your decisions. It means being able to say quietly and without performance, I remember what that